Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote: a passed pawn increases in strength as the number of pieces on the board diminishes. From one of the chess greats, Jose Raul Capablanca. A brief review of the last part, where we continued our study of part 2 of the book, Position Play, and its first chapter, the conception of position play and the problem of the center. We continued discussing the topic of the paramount importance of the center and then moved on to the next topic of combining overprotection with centralization, with illustrations from Nimzowitsch. So now, moving further into the book, Nimzowitsch continues the discussion on combining overprotection with centralization. He writes, I too, both theoretically and in practice, am absolutely on the side of centralization. Examine, say, my game against Eatchipps, Semmering 1926, in which I had the black pieces. E4, E6, D4, D5, Knight C3, Bishop B4, E takes on D5, E takes on D5, Bishop D3, Knight E7, Knight E2, castling, castling, Bishop G4, F3, Bishop H5, Knight F4, Bishop G6, Knight E2, Bishop D6 and Queen E1. Here a bishop takes on G6 instead, followed by Knight D3 would have comported with the spirit of centralization, and the points C5 and E5 would then have been kept under perpetual observation. So Queen E1, C5, D takes on C5, Bishop takes on C5 check, King H1, Knight C6, Bishop D2, Rook E8, Knight takes on G6 and H takes on G6, creates a central point at F5, F4. The normal development of things would have been Queen H4 instead of F4. Knight F5, Queen takes on D8, Rook takes on D8, and Black has a slight advantage for the endgame. So F4, Knight F5, C3, D4, C4, Queen B6, Rook F3 and Bishop B4 to occupy the central point E3. A3, Bishop takes on D2, Queen takes on D2, A5 equals to restraint. Knight G1, Rook E3, Queen F2, Rook E8, Rook D1, Queen B3, Rook D2, Knight D6, C5, Knight C4, Bishop takes on C4 and a Queen takes on a C4. White C-pawn is weak. The blockading bishop at D3 has been got out of the way, and the central pressure is more burdensome to white than ever. Rook C2, Queen D5, Rook C1 and a Queen E4. With this move, centralization is completed. White sacrificed a pawn by F5 in order to defend himself against the ever-increasing pressure in the E file, but lost the ending after Rook takes on F3, Queen takes on F3, and queen takes on f5. Further striking examples of centralization will be found in great plenty in the games of the masters. We will only mention Alekhine versus Trebal, Baden-Baden, 1925, and Nimzowitsch versus Spielmann, San Sebastian, 1912. See game number 49 of the illustrative game section. Please note that we shall go through this second game mentioned by Nimzowitsch here towards the end of the video series, along with other remaining games from the illustrative game section of the book. Nimzowitsch continues. We now proceed to the analysis of play in the center versus play on a wing. The game Nimzowitsch versus Alekhine 1926 just given furnishes an example of how such a struggle usually proceeds. The central player always has the better prospects, and very especially in the frequently recurring positions which we are about to outline. One party has undertaken a diversion against their opponent's king's wing, which in itself promises a reward. All would be in the most perfect order, but that there is always a but. Their opponent holds an open center file, and with astounding regularity, the flank attack is shipwrecked on this rock. This state of affairs is not accidental, it has its own inner logic. See the position on board. We will first note the ground plan of such a situation. In the position shown, black's attack must always fail, because their rooks are under the unpleasant obligation to guard their base, their first and second ranks, against an inroad of the white rooks, who are all ready for the adventure. In addition, e5 is insufficiently protected, and this again is not accidental, since the white knight is centralized in harmony with the rest of the white structure. Nimzowitsch remarks on this position alongside its diagram in the book as follows. The black knight is the mainstay of the black player, but it is not too formidable. Nimzowitsch continues. As the whole matter is of extraordinary importance to an understanding of the spirit of the theory of the center, we will illustrate it by a complete game. Rubinstein versus Nimzowitsch, San Sebastian, 1912. d4, knight f6, c4, d6, knight c3, knight d7, knight f3, e5, e4, and bishop e7. Probably there is nothing against g6 and bishop g7 instead of bishop e7. So bishop e7, bishop e2, castling, castling, rook e8, queen c2, bishop f8, d3, and c6. Here, as Lasker rightly pointed out, the sounder line of play for black was g6 instead of c6. Bishop g7, then e takes on d4 and knight e5. So c6, bishop b2, knight h5, question mark, g3, knight b8, and rook d1. The center file looms up. Queen f6, knight b1, bishop h3, rook e1, and knight f4. That I should be able to get the knight to f4 under any circumstances, I had foreseen when I played knight h5 a misfortune. for else I would have withstood the temptation to undertake this diversion. Nimzowitsch writes of this position alongside its diagram in the book as follows. White, Rubinstein, demonstrates by clever play the weakness of black's diversion on the king's side. Nimzowitsch continues. D takes on e5, d takes on e5, knight takes on e5, rook takes on e5, and bishop f1. After bishop takes on e5, instead of a bishop f1, knight takes on e2 check, queen takes on e2, queen takes on e5, and rook d8, the center file. White would also have the advantage. So bishop f1, knight d7, and queen d2. Now the black pieces embarked on their diversion are in the air. Bishop takes on f1, rook takes on f1, knight h3 check, king g2, and knight g5, threatening mate in 2. f4, queen g6, f takes on g5, and rook takes on e4, question mark. After queen takes on e4 check, king h3, rook e7, and rook e1, white would have won a piece. Relatively best for black was rook e7. The win then could only have been attained by bishop a3 and c5, not queen takes on e4 check, because of a king g1, c5, and rook e1. So c5 and knight c3. For after c5, which is forced, there is no possibility of playing knight c5 for black, while on the other hand, white has d5 as a base for his operations. But rook takes on e4 was played in the game. Queen takes on d7, rook e2 check, rook f2, and white won. See also game number 28 of the illustrative game section of the book, Qhinn versus Capablanca, for another variation on the same theme. Please note that we shall go through this game in one of the upcoming parts of the video series. Moving further, Nimzowitsch begins the next topic, number 7, the surrender of the center, and writes, as early as 1911 and 1912, I had published some notes on games in which I put forward what was then an entirely new idea, that the center need not necessarily be occupied by pawns, that centrally posted pieces or even lines bearing on the center could, as I maintained, take the place of pawns. The main point being to place the enemy center pawns under restraint. This idea I embodied in an article 1913, which by the courtesy of the Wiener Schachzeitung I am allowed to reproduce here, and do so because in this, the age of the neo-romantic school, it is in a high pertinent. The article ran as follows. When black in the much disputed variation of the French defense, e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, plays d takes on e4, black gives up, according to the current opinion, the center. This view seems to me to rest upon an incomplete grasp, in fact a misconception of what the center is. In what follows, the attempt will be made. Number 1. to show that this view is based on a prejudice. Number 2, to set out its historical development. And first, the definition of the concept center. Here we have simply to abide by the meaning of the word. The center consists of the squares in the middle of the board. Squares, not pawns. This is fundamental and must never under any circumstances be lost sight of. The importance of the center, that is to say, the complex of squares in the middle of the board as a base for further operations, is beyond question. And a note of Emanuel Lasker's to a game is worth recalling. White, he wrote, does not stand well in the center, undertake an operation in the wing. This is finely conceived and at the same time illustrates the close relationship between the center and the wings. The center being the dominating principle, the wings subordinate to it. The control of the center must be of great significance. Is other considerations apart, clear from one thing, that if we have built up our game in the center, we have from thence the possibility of exercising influence on both wings at one and the same time, and of embarking on a diversion should opportunity offer. Without healthy conditions in the center, a healthy position is definitely unthinkable. We spoke of a control of the center. What are we to understand by this? How is this conditioned? Current opinion holds that the center should be occupied by pawns. Pawn at e4 and pawn at d4 for white, and e5 and d5 for black is the ideal. But in fact, the presence of one of these two pawns postulates occupation of the center, provided the corresponding enemy pawn is wanting. But is this really the case? Is the pawn at d4 after the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, d takes on e4 and knight takes on e4 justified in speaking of a conquest of the center? If in a battle I seize a bit of debatable land with a handful of soldiers without having done anything to prevent an enemy bombardment of the position, would it ever occur to me to speak of a conquest of the terrain in question? Obviously not. Then why should I do so in chess? It dawns upon us then that the control of the center depends not on a mere occupation, placing of pawns, but rather on our general effectiveness there, and this is determined by quite other factors. This thought I have formulated thus. With the disappearance of a pawn from the center, for example, d takes on e4 and knight takes on e4 as illustrated here, the center is a long way from being surrendered. The true conception of the center is a far wider one. Certainly, pawns as being the most stable are best suited to building a center. Nevertheless, centrally posted pieces can perfectly well take their place, and too, pressure exerted on the enemy center by the long-range action of rooks or bishops directed on it can well be of corresponding importance. We meet this last case in the variation d takes on e4. This move, so wrongly described as a surrender of the center, as a matter of fact, increases black's effective influence in the center very considerably. For with the removal by d takes on e4 of the black pawn at d5, which is an obstruction, black gets a free hand in the d file, and the long diagonal b7 to h1, which black will open for themselves by b6. Obstruction, that is the dark side of the occupation of the center by pawns. A pawn is by nature, by their stability, their, so to speak, conservative spirit, a good center builder, but alas, a pawn is also an obstruction. The effective influence in the center is independent of the number of pawns occupying it, appears from many examples, and of their abundance we will take one or two. Pieces in the center. Number 1. Black's pawns at e6 and d5, held under restraint by the white knight at e3 and pawn at c3. For example, the position on board from the game Nimzowitsch vs. Leeuwenfish, Carlsbad, 1911. Number 2. The isolated pawn couple at d5 and c6, rigidly blockaded by white pieces, as in the position on board. The two cases quoted show us a blockade, but blockade is an elastic term, and often a slight restraint induced by an annoying rook whose primary function was to hold up the advance of the enemy center may be the prelude to a complete crippling which culminates in its mechanical stoppage. The cases in which pressure is exerted on the enemy center are without number. See, for example, the position on board, where the course of events will lead either to a blockade with consequent destruction of the white e-pawn, for movement is life, or to uncomfortable positions for the defending pieces, which will lead to the downfall of the lucky possessor of the center. All this teaches us that by counting the head of the pawns in the center, nothing, literally nothing, is gained. To make mere arithmetic the starting point of a philosophy of the center can only be characterized as a mistaken proceeding. I am sure that in a very few years, no one will regard d takes on e4 here as a surrender of the center. And with the disappearance of such a preposition, the way will be clear for a new and brilliant development in chess philosophy and strategy. A word on the genesis or origins of this prejudice, which is closely bound up with the history of position play. First came Steinitz, but what he had to say was so unfamiliar, and he himself was so towering a figure, that his modern principles could not immediately become popular. There followed Tarrasch, who took hold of Steinitz's ideas and served them up diluted to the public taste. And now to consider the application to our case. Steinitz was, we repeat, deep and great, but deepest and greatest in his conception of the center, when in his defense to the Lopez d6, he was able to transmute the enemy pawn at e4, which was to all appearances so healthy, into one whose weakness was patent to every eye. This was an unsurpassable achievement. Nothing lay further from his thoughts than a formalistic arithmetical conception of the center. So far the article. For illustrations, we would refer the reader to part 1 of the book, chapter on the pawn chain, and to game number 26 of the illustrative game section of the book, Tarrasch vs. Mises. The reader is also urged to study before proceeding games number 25 to 30 of the illustrative games section of the book, which bear on this chapter. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch My System here, where this chapter also concludes. We shall continue onwards from the next part by going through the games referred by Nimzowitsch here. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream. Unfortunately, I could not get the complete data for the quantity of cheers from Twitch this time around, which is why only the users' names are displayed here in that category. Some new supporters: Dr. Chainsaw, Fooldan, Megalodon, Jaxifer, and Eatchipps. Thank you for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.